time to shake up your world again. Remember when you were a child, and if you were learning English, you sat in a classroom and you looked above the blackboard and you saw these letters, and they trained you how to shape those letters with exercises, and you had to write them and copy them and imitate them. And some of them were cursive and others were just block letters. But believe it or not, where did those letters come from originally? Well, some of them came from Iberith, what we call Hebrew, the language. The letter A, for example, is actually shaped the same way. It's just tilted 90 degrees on its side. And if you take the A and tilt it back straight, you see the first letter of the Latin and the Greek. Alpha is the Greek name for it, and the Latin, we just call it A, the sound of the letter mostly, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like the long A. Sometimes it has different sounds to it and different words. But where did it start? It started in the Hebrew. It had the same shape originally. It was called Aleph. That was the letter in Hebrew. And it went into the Greek, and then it went into the Latin. And if you're interested at all, I want to show you, this is the third book in a series, and it's called the Iberith Vocabulary. Iberith Vocabulary Series 3. Look this up on Amazon.com, Paleo Hebrew. This is the letter Gimel, and you'll see that it's large print. It's a very nice book, and it shows you apparently, let's see, there's 110 Hebrew words starting with the letter Gimel, and we'd like to see you pick that up. And there's two other books, the Aleph and the Beth. That's where you get the word alphabet, Aleph, Beth. So get those books, Aleph, Beth, Gimel. This is the third letter. And she's coming out with 22 books. This is Margaret St. Peter's work. And you can go to Amazon and pick this up. Just look for this book. It won't have this gray bar because this is actually not for sale. That's a sign that it's not for sale. But it looks, it means camel. It has other names, but other meanings. But this is the primary letter in 110 words in Hebrew. The language that you're looking at in most cases where they're teaching you Hebrew, the script itself is not this script because they've adopted the Assyrian/Babylonian script, but they're training you to speak Hebrew with all sorts of different methods to keep you averted from saying things correctly. This is the original language letter Gimel, Hebrew. Now, I want to point out another thing. Remember the Latin letters? Well, we didn't even really call them that. The alphabet, when you were a child and you were being taught to read and write, you were trained in Latin letters. And you maybe didn't remember that, but the whole world was trained how to read English letters. They call them English letters, but that's because they originated from England. And the Anglican Catholic Circus actually trained the world to speak English using the King James Version, which was written in a very difficult shaped letter, but it was still English, and you could barely read it. But anyway, the King James Version was the way that the world learned to speak English, and they learned to read it that way. Anyway, in the original first edition of the King James Version, there's a strange thing that appears. The name Jesus isn't in the first edition. This is what you see in place of the name. IESV, as we understand it. These are Latin letters that were inherited from a 1,200-year-old volume called the Latin Vulgate, and that was, of course, translated back in the late 4th century, and it's something that Jerome, they call him, Eusebius Hieronymus Sophronius was his real name, and he was the headmaster at the Alexandrian school, catechetical school. He was a headmaster, and he translated the Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and he used this word, or this Christogram. See that bar under it? That bar is called a titlos, and the Latin Vulgate was used by the Roman Catholic circus for about 1,200 years before the King James Version, and they used this in the Latin Vulgate. It's amazing, isn't it? This is a replacement term, though. It's not his name, but it's in place of his name. The titlos, or the title bar below the name, indicates that it is the name of a deity, but it's encrypted. How about that? They encrypted his name in the Latin Vulgate. And then when the Anglican Catholic translators began their work, and they ran across the name IESV, that's actually not a V, it's a U. In Latin, that's a U. It's Esu, that's how they pronounce it. But that's not really real, because this is an encoded word. So it's really a trick. It stands in place of a name, and they admit it. That term, you look this up, it's called Christogram. It's something that replaces the real one. And it could be in the Western Empire of the Roman Catholic circus. It would be IHS. The H is actually a capital Greek letter, and it stands for E. It's really IES, but they make it a capital letter. The H is actually an E, the shape. So IHS was the Christogram for the name, and that was different in the Eastern Empire, where Constantinople, or the original city Byzantium, they renamed it Constantinople, and now it's known as Istanbul. But the same city went through 3 names that we know of, and they called the name IC-XC, IC-XC, and that was their code. They had a titlos below it, just like the Egyptian cartouches used for names. Well, I want to just open up with this letter W that we're seeing everywhere. Where did that come from? It originally came from the Greek letter upsilon, which is a U. And but even before that, it was the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and we refer to that as a U also. It's ua. It's a vowel. There's no consonantal sounds to it. Anyway, the script that we see using the V shape is a Latin letter. Originally sounded as our letter, U. Like the word gladius would be spelled with a GLADIVS. But the V is the deception. It's not really a V, it's just a U sound. Gladius. It's a Latin word that means sword. And you'll see certain old inscriptions on government buildings using Latin letters, and they'll shape it as a V. I saw the word morgue, M-O-R-G-U-E, spelled M-O-R-G-V-E in an old movie. And it really isn't morgue, it's morgue. It's just amazing. So anyway, what happened was, it derived from the Greek letter upsilon, this V shape. Now picture this. The Greek upsilon looks like a Y. It's got a V shape, and then there's a stem at the bottom, so it looks like a capital Y. But it operates as a U. And the Latin dropped the lower stem. They just sort of made it simple, and they just kept this V shape, but it was still operating as a U. The double U, where you see things printed with two V's, is the invention of a metal typesetter sometime after 1450 CE. You know, back in the Middle Ages, Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, where they could print one page at a time. And that printing press, they had to actually use metal letters, and then they put them in arrangement so that when they rolled the ink over it and then pressed it, that's why it's called a press, they would have a big, you know, like a vise, and clamp that baby down on a piece of parchment or paper. And the interesting thing is, this double V, or W, did not exist anywhere on Earth before 1450. The first major printing project for Gutenberg's movable type press was the Latin Vulgate. And the Latin Vulgate had been in operation for at least 1,200 years by the time 1450 came along. And the interesting thing about that is the Latin Vulgate was his first job, and he was printing it in Latin. So they used that as the basis for the King James Version. It represented the name of Yahusha, the IESV, let's call it ASU, as an encrypted code with an underscore. It had an underline. The King James Version, the Anglican Catholic translation, actually used the Latin Vulgate to translate the first edition of the King James Version into English. It was called the Authorized Version. A first edition photo, I'll put up here on the screen, shows, this is an actual photo of the first edition with the word IESV and the underscore, or titlos. It's a title bar, and it's the indication that this is the name of a deity, just as the ancient Egyptians used to designate their deities' names using a cartouche. The producer is Gutenberg. He's the one that was responsible for inventing this letter, or one of his typesetters. It was a metal piece of type, and they just basically reproduced that character that you know as W. And they still call it double U. So let's call the letter U, U, and call the letter W, double U. There's no W in Greek, and there's no W in Hebrew. So let's get with the program and learn Hebrew, and pick up some Hebrew books and study this. Not that other language. And if you want to look at the way they transliterate the name, they use different forms, but the name of Yahusha is what is represented by this IESV. Yahusha, there it is. It's H3091. That's the concordance number. And in Greek, it's G2424 in the Greek dictionary. But they still adopt that IES arrangement. And his name, Yahusha, is based upon the name of the Father, H3068. And he's not G-O-D. That's the word theos. This is the Old English. The Old English word G-O-D is a Norse sun deity, but it comes from this comes from the mistranslation of the word theos, which is G2316. Anyway, that's just they're attempting to make things understandable, but actually in the process they make it more confusing. Watch this video 2 or 3 times and see if anything comes up that you can test on the internet, look things up, and validate what you're hearing everywhere. Look for physical proof. Thanks for watching this, and we'll see you in the next exciting video.